Good evening, everybody. It's good to have everybody out this evening. Just a couple minutes, we'll get started on lesson number 8, which is in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We'll be looking at this lesson in just a minute. We've asked Don, if he would, to go ahead and lead us in prayer before we get started, though. So,
Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you at the beginning of this service, thanking you for everything you do for us, thanking you for your Son, thanking you for the Word that we have, that we can study and learn more of what you would have us to do. We ask you to be with the teacher tonight, that he will have a ready recollection. We ask you to be with us as students, that we will be able to take something to apply it to our lives, that we will be better servants of thine. We ask that everything we do tonight is in accordance with thy will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. As we've been looking through the whole book of Ecclesiastes and seeing over time about being under the sun and everything is vanity and strife, we see a kind of a hopeless picture is what it seems like, starting off of going through several of these chapters. But we started to see a turn in chapter 7 of looking a little bit more upward, looking a little bit more towards God and looking at those. And we're going to see Solomon continue to move in that direction as we go through this chapter and also next week in chapter 9. So right now, this is on page 43 in your book. If you have that still, we're going to be looking both between the book and just some other applications from the lesson here tonight. This is a chapter is titled Leaders, Losers, and Unsolved Mysteries. And we're going to start off with kind of leaders and looking at some leadership things and some of those things along that line. Before we do, let's just turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and we'll read the first 9 verses of that. So, Ecclesiastes 8, verses 1. Who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumines him and causes his stern face to beam. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil matter, for he will do whatever he pleases. Since the word of the king is authoritative, who will say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble, for a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every delight, though a man's trouble is heavy upon him. If no one knows what will happen, who can tell him what will happen? No man has authority to restrain the wind, with the wind, or authority over the day of death. And there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. All this I have seen and applied my mind to every deed that has been done under the sun, wherein a man has exercised authority over another man to his hurt. So in this kind of section, we see Solomon again looking at based upon all the different experiences he's had, based upon all the things that he was looking at, going to look at now, and as Wilson looks at us also in this book, a little bit on leadership and some of the different things that he sees in leaders and some of the things we see out of that. So we're going to look at a couple things here, just some leadership myths to start off with, and feel free to comment on these things. If you have a comment you want to go a little longer on, go ahead and just raise your hand. We got mics on both sides. We'll run those down to you. But also, this is going to be just kind of like a true and false to start off too. So feel free to shout out some of the different responses as well. So leadership is a rare skill. True or false? You think it's true? Everybody agree with that? It's got a lot of heads shaking both ways. Good leaders can be a rare skill at times, and we don't see that in our society as much. But leadership is something that can be trained and something you can acquire. It's not something that's so rare you cannot get it, like some of the different things that you might not that you might think of as being rarity and stuff. But it is something, as we see nowadays, when you go anywhere and you see somebody that is practicing a little bit of leadership, you can kind of tell in almost any situation a little bit of heads over tail who's really shining in some cases just by going to some place. It could be anywhere, and we'll look at that a little bit more too. Leaders are born and not made. Is that true? False, right? Because we can see that they're made. We talked about that a little bit. Some people do have innate skills, it seems like, but probably that was from their raising and upbringing and different things. What about leaders have all the answers? No. No, leaders do not have all the answers, and often some of the best leaders do learn by mistakes over time. Mistakes can be a great lesson, a great teacher in a lot of ways. Can learn. It's how you deal with that mistake or whatever. It makes all the difference in the world. So leaders work smarter, not harder. Well, Bill's saying maybe on there, so a little bit of both. Yeah, it can be. I mean, anybody can work smarter. That's kind of a phrase we use, but in the kind of connotation this is used at, you could have a 4.0 MIT, brainiac and be a terrible leader. And you could have a guy that grew up on the streets and never went to college in his life and be a great leader. It's not necessarily from working smarter or being smarter. Some cases that can bring out some leadership on some of those things too. What about next section here? Leaders are always in the spotlight. False, yeah, right? A lot of times you might not see what a leader's doing. He's behind the scenes a lot of cases, and a lot of things could be making things happen. We'll look at some other examples, but sometimes when that leader's always in the spotlight, it's not necessarily a good thing, is it? We all know some of those people over time, and some of that just does not play well in some cases as far as when they're trying to practice their leadership and some of those things. So what about leaders are always on? False. Why would that be, Harley? Oh, no. Yeah. Okay, so leaders are not always on. They're human, right? So leaders make mistakes. Leaders get tired. Leaders have frustrations. There's a lot of things that happen within somebody that's leading in different areas, and especially since they're human, they're never going to be always on. They get sick sometimes, stressed, and basically can make mistakes, as we saw earlier too. What about leaders are created by extraordinary circumstances? Okay, all right. Discovered but not created. I think Bill's on to something there, right? You can see sometimes leadership rise out of those occasions, just in different things that happen, but doesn't necessarily that means that's the only thing that happens to make somebody that way. What about leaders exist only at the top of an organization? All right, nope. You can see leaders throughout the whole organization several times. So somebody had a comment over here, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're talking about leaders created by extraordinary circumstances. Well, sometimes the best leaders come out of the most meager of circumstances. That sermon this morning is a good demonstration of that.
Yep. Seeing the small things, those things coming out of, good leaders can come out of small things. And we've seen other cases of that as well, yep. Where are we at there? Leaders exist only at the top of the organization. We talked about that. No, that's not necessarily so. And again, you can see that just among your work people that you get in contact with, people at the school, whatever it might be. You can see different people that just, the cream rises to the top sometimes. You can see some people that take initiative, that go ahead and do some things, and all of a sudden they start falling into leadership, even though they don't necessarily are at the top. They're making some things happen along the way. What about leaders controls or directs or prods or manipulates? Is that true or false? False, okay. Sometimes a leader might have to prod a little bit in some cases, but generally that's not the case. We're going to look at just a small slide in a minute, the differences between leadership and management. Management sometimes does some of those things. Leaders generally don't have to do those things. They do it in a different way. And what about leaders define leadership? All right, got one head shaking no. Anybody else? Leaders define leadership? Who defines leadership? Well, God in the spiritual sense of leaders that way, if you're looking at the church and some of those things. But who defines leadership ultimately? Followers, right? Because if a leader doesn't have any followers, he's not really a leader, right? Maybe in his own mind, but that's a different scenario, right? So what are some other myths you might think of about leaderships or some of those things? Got any? I thought of a couple. One has to be old to be a leader. It's not necessarily true. Could be, but not necessarily. What about one of the biggest myths, though? you are not a leader. Right? Because everybody here is a leader some way, somehow. Am I wrong on that? Somebody's watching, right? You know, remember, some of you remember the commercial years ago that was a cigarette commercial that was a public service announcement about the dad doing different various things, and he had his young son with him, and the young son were mimicking everything, and then the dad would actually got to sitting down around the tree and pulled out a pack of cigarettes and started to smoke the cigarettes. And after all these sequence of these things, the kid mimicking the dad, the boy grabbed a hold of the pack of cigarettes, you know, because he was looking like he was going to mimic that too. So you're being seen by other people and other things. By the way, that was 1967 when that public service announcement first came out, which is hard to believe. I looked that up. But that has been a long time ago. But it said that kids can be poor listeners but great observers. And that's something that, you know, any one of us who have had kids or around kids in some of these different areas that we find ourselves in, even in the church family that they look up to, the different things, they're watching. And so we can always be a leader. Other questions you might ask about if anybody counts on you, you're probably a leader in some capacity in that way too. So don't buy into the myth that, oh, that's leaders is just for somebody else. That's somebody else. We need to take a hold of that ourselves as well in our own circumstances about how we can lead as well. Any other comments on that or any other observations? Come down here, Steve, please.
I can't remember the exact number, but according to all the published records, that even the most introverted person will influence over 8,000 people in their lives.
Wow.
And really, when we talk about leadership, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about influence. You know,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what causes followers to follow after the leaders is their influence.
Yeah, wow, I didn't hear that statistic, but that's a huge one there. But yeah, we all are influencing different people and looking at different things. Nowadays, I think some of this, you mentioned follower, it made me think social media followers and how that gets really crazy on some of that. That's a little different than what we're talking about. But we all have opportunities and looking at different things that we can do in different places we can lead at. We all have those opportunities. So where are they? You know, here's a couple at work. You know, you're going to have some leadership opportunities. At school, you're going to have some leadership opportunities. Among your friends, your peers, you can stand out and be a leader in that situation as well. What's some other ones you can think of? Family, all right? That's the next section there too. You can be leaders to your children. You can be leaders to your spouse, your overall family. Can be you could be a leader in those things. Other things, what can you think about? Leaders with neighbors, okay. So, you're within your community, within the civic organizations possibly. PTA might be one in situations, or local politics could be another in situation, or just being a coach or a mentor. Those type of things give you some leadership opportunities. Harley said just within your community, your own neighbors and stuff. They're observing you and seeing you, and you can have influence with them too as well. What about church in church? You know, you could be a leader in church. We're going to look at a couple things within that. Military, you got a whole series of ranks that you can go through and different things. Also sports teams and different things. There's a lot of leadership opportunities that we have every day of our life that we're working in with every day of our life. So in looking at all those and then just looking at the questions that we're looking at, it says that everything rises or falls on leadership. What happens in companies when leaders are indecisive, unclear, and have no vision? You got a comment down here?
The company fails.
All right, we see failure from the company.
Yeah. And I've been with Home Depot for 5 years, coming up in the next 2 weeks. And I've been through maybe 5, maybe 6 store general managers. And I can see some good ones, and I can see some that are very poor. They're just not. They got their position somehow, but they're really not qualified because they're not showing good leadership skills. It's kind of sad. I had an associate today call me this afternoon. I'm technically on vacation, he called me up and I actually was able to walk him through how to design and sell a door to a customer. I've told him 100 times and he still doesn't remember how to do it, but I finally got it done. I'm not necessarily a leader, but,
That's a myth.
well, that's true. But I'm not recognized in that capacity,
Yeah.
but I'm still doing it.
Right, and that's great, that influence you have there in that situation. Even though they're bothering you on vacation, they know they can find a solution from you. So, yeah, that's the kind of influence that can help you in a lot of different ways, not only at your work job, but it also can help you with the gospel at different times. Because when people start looking at you in those kind of ways of looking at counting on your counsel for different things, they're respecting you for part of who you are in your life. And that can open the door to other parts of your life too. Tim, did you have something?
I was just thinking, maybe going along with what Harley said, maybe not, but even in family as well as business, where anger, frustration, lack of desire to do anything, if the leadership does not have clear vision or goals or directions or encouragement, then, why should I bother? And especially with children, if there's no clear direction in the parental units.
Yeah, you see that in some cases in a lot of different businesses, especially the ones I've been experienced with in different areas where it might have been a family business, or friends of mine might have had their different took over the business, or their children took over the business. And what you see sometimes is a lot of people within the organization, if that child doesn't have the same passion the father did or the grandfather did, you start to really see a deterioration of that business. And also, like you said, Tim, a frustration of those people within that organization. Because what do they say? We used to have a saying within John Deere, it's all relative, all relative based. It's not that you worked your job, way into the job. You got your job because of who you knew, or because you're somebody's son, or because of your last name, or whatever. So some of those things can be really frustrating, especially when those leaders are indecisive or unclear and have no real vision to lead that company. Again, we see that. What about that? And you mentioned there the family. You see that in some cases in local churches. We have a whole different set of circumstances and special responsibilities when it comes to those things within the local church. But that's pretty much encompassing anywhere. When you see bad leadership, and you see failure of leaders to act, you see failures of vision in leadership, it just can't help itself. Over time, that organization is going to die. It's going to fall away. People are going to go look to where they can find something more attractive and everything. So, and now we kind of went through a lot of this and stuff. So according to the end of verse 1, what should characterize God's leader? Okay, shining face is part of that, right? So it's something that makes his face shine, right? Anybody else? They've got to be approachable to be able to look at things. Let's look at some other things. We'll look at a couple things within that and get to that, Amy, here in just a second. So Solomon's looking at different things. In verse 1, especially 1a, basically talks about looking at good leaders need the clear mind to see the big picture. They want to be able to see through the problems to a solution. And you guys have probably known people that can see that. It's often been said, if you know the problem, that's 75% of the solution. So Bill, go ahead.
Yeah, I think along those lines, I was thinking of the idea here, who is like the wise, who knows the interpretation of a thing. One of the things about leaders is they aren't necessarily, they don't have the answers, and they very well may not be the smartest person in the room, most likely are not. But they can bring clarity out of the confusion. Mm-hmm. Not meaning that they can bring the answer to you, but they can help define the problem and make sure people focus on the right thing, and that way you pull the right intelligence from the right person, and all of a sudden things seem to make sense to everybody.
Yep. Yeah, that's a special trait when you can see that happen that way. Too, there are some leaders too that are what you'd call quick slicers, that they can see all the way to the end. They can kind of just cut through it. That's a rarity, I think, in some cases, but there does seem to be some people that have that gift that can be able to just look at a situation and recognize what the problem is and kind of see where the solution should head to. Tim, go ahead.
It may pop up here in a minute, but I think leaders know their people. So again, if you, like Bill said, if you are confronted with a serious problem, you can say, hey, I know Fred, he's done this before, let him lead this. And sometimes the leader has to step back, let other people take it if they have a better handle.
Yeah, there's some people who do not want any part of leadership roles in case of, they make a mistake or because of those things as well. We're going to look at several of these things, but you've seen that also in different people that will be part of, maybe like Harley's talking about, I don't know if his case is that way, but somebody he's working with who's scared to make a decision on their own. They have to always, go to somebody else. And we used to call that, take your hand on them and just kind of push them this way and turn them this way. And, you almost had to walk them everywhere because they had minds of their own, but they didn't use minds of their own. So they didn't want to use a mind of their own in some cases. But here we see that this clearly needs to see the big picture. They see through problems in a lot of cases. They know that interpretation. They find that interpretation one way or another. As Bill said, they could use other people around them. We're going to see that's really a positive thing when they do that as well. I had a little thing that I was looking at that is just talking about seeing the bigger picture and being able to see those decisions sometimes under pressure. We're a local here, and you guys know I'm a Tampa Bay sports fan, and Bill Belichick recently was talking about Tom Brady, and he was talking about how Tom Brady, as you all know, is considered the GOAT, the greatest of all time, is what they consider him around here. And he says, I learned so much from Tom because, as you know, I never played quarterback, and I never saw the game through the quarterback's eyes. I saw it through a coach's eyes, and Tom would tell me what he saw and how he saw it. So here's Bill Belichick, who's one of the greatest coaches of all time, going to be a first-round Hall of Famer, recognizing he couldn't see the game the same way Tom Brady could, that he needed to get Tom Brady's input to be part of that duo of what those were. He went on to say, it was incredible how during the game he'd come off and I would say to him, what happened on that play? And he'd go through 8 things that happened. Tackle flashed right in front of me. This guy slipped. I saw the linebacker drop wide. Safety was a little deeper than I thought he would be. And that guy stepped in front, so I kind of put it a little bit behind him because I saw the other guy closing. And Belichick said when he'd go back and look at the film, it would be exactly the exact sequence that he explained it to us on the field. He's like, this guy is special. He can see just about everything. And so, we kind of, the sports analogy, we don't want to follow these guys for a life analogy or, those things, but sports analogy, that's one of the reasons why he's the greatest of all time. He could make instant, split-second decisions, with 350-pound people chasing him, kind of deal. So, so when we look at those things, even with there, great leaders do need a clear mind to see the bigger picture. And he wasn't born that way, though, either. He practiced over and over and over. Tape, everything else, and watching tape, doing different things he went to see. But he was a secular example of some of that team of both of those guys being some of the best that they possibly are, saw that they needed to work together. That they also saw that each one of them probably could have had a lot more ego if they wanted to, but they knew really part of their leadership became even better when they recognized that they needed other people on that too. So what about, this is getting close to what Amy was saying a minute ago, great leaders in 1B also understand that leaders is relational, not necessarily positional. A stern face turns, that to me is a positive person. A cheerful heart reflects the positivity. We have some leaders in some places that could be just their position is what brought them into leadership. But over a period of time, like we talked about those companies without vision and stuff like that, that position is going to be, they're not going to have leaders long or followers long, because if it's only positional, it's missing the equation that it needs to be able to be that relational. It's going to be that stern face versus the cheerful face and those things too. So Solomon was speaking here, not only reflecting on how that is, but we've all seen different places of what we would call no faces, right? I mean, that's been one of my frustrations, one of my phrases sometimes. If you go to different places, sometimes, whatever it might be. Sometimes it could be governmental, sometimes it could be other things. But it's almost like they're trying to find a way to say no. Always looking for a way to say no rather than looking for a potential solution. And this particular person looks like he's more of one of those things, trying to find a way to say yes. trying to be that relational, trying to work with that, as Tim said a minute ago, knowing people, knowing strengths and weaknesses, and trying to work within those too. So, Harley? Yeah.
What I was going to say is, one of the traits of a decent leader is you can always tell when they have their heart in what they're trying to do. And if their heart's in it, then they're going to be able to motivate other people along the same line. That's you know, when you have a decent leader, you've got good morale in the business and everything else. So if you have a leader that doesn't, you can tell that they're not interested in the business, or they don't have their heart in it, the whole thing goes to pot.
Yeah.
The morale's down and everything's sour. But when they're cheerful and they're really trying to help everybody, everybody's in the team.
Yep. Yep.
That makes a big difference.
Well, and that's what he's kind of saying here. It's that leaders are looking at that more of that cheerful heart, and looking at those ways of turning their face from not just being a stern face. So great leaders also speak with discretion. Here Solomon's talking both to leaders and followers in this passage a little bit, but it's talking about having a discreet tongue. And that's some of some of this is talking about being loyal to leaders and being how to be able to manage through that, but also leaders that best inspire their followers, sometimes they're very careful in how they use their tongue. Because sometimes, let's just use possibly an example of being in an inner circle of a team of senior leaders, say, maybe, or something. But then all of a sudden those senior leaders start talking about somebody, then somebody else talks about somebody, then sooner or later it comes back around to the person that they're talking about. How inspired are they going to be to follow that leader? You know, that can be anything, and it can also extend to spouses. You know, it's in certain leadership roles, the spouses need to really guard their tongues, because as a husband and wife team, there's going to be things shared that should be positive, of support of each other, but sometimes it might come into some information that could be very troubling if it got outside of maybe what it was intended to, just those two. So we've seen some of that at the top at different places and different places as well. So they need to all leaders need to watch their tongues, but also followers need to watch their tongues as well. So great leaders also know the value of timing. Here it's talked about have keen judgment, looking at of those things coming and going. You know, when you look at especially verses 5 and 6, we see that some of those things come into play. Not always are things cut and dry. Leaders sometimes have to make judgment decisions that are key for them to make those decisions. And sometimes having that keen judgment is going to be a helpful skill. Somebody over here? Okay. Right.
I wanted to go back really quick to the speaking with discretion. I think as Christians, when we're leading in the community and in life with other people as well, sometimes we say things that are kind of, I'm going to call them like catchphrases. We tend to kind of get them and we make them, and we're not always fully informed, or maybe we're meaning one thing, but we're making a generalization, and we can really lose our influence with other people, especially non-Christians. I know as a teacher, one thing like I hear all the time is when people start talking about, well, in schools that, you know, all this is being taught, and I see where people are coming from, but I know that there's several of us here who are educators, and that's not what we're teaching, it's not what we're doing, and it can be really discouraging, you know, to hear that. So I think that's one thing too when you're talking about leadership in the community as a Christian. If you start making comments and and we all do it, I know I do it, but I think it's something to guard yourself, speaking with discretion, because things like that can shut down people from talking to you about Christ, or to other Christians from coming and saying, I'm having a struggle because we're making an offhanded comment or a very general comment, and that it impacts people and it hurts people, and it can really hurt our influence with others where, you know what, somebody might not want to come and talk to you about something now and get help because you've been making comments sometimes out of ignorance, and we don't mean to, but I think that's really a really important part of discretion, and it goes with all the other parts of leadership. If anyone's ever had a boss that has done that, it sticks with you, and as Christians, it sticks with other people as well.
Yeah, good point. Any other comments? Over here, Tim? Arlene?
Yeah, backing up to that, I think the idea of trustworthy, if you have a boss and you're going to go to them and you tell them something in secret and then it comes out real quick, that's certainly not going to encourage you to work. But I think on number 4, probably no better example perhaps, I'm sure there are a ton, than a husband and wife regarding timing. There are times when you should say something a certain way to your wife, and sometimes you should say, this is not the best time for me to really be honest, or, I'm not saying lie.
Whoa,
but,
whoa, whoa.
what? Okay, just checking.
I hate to jump in on that one.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to back to a little bit of discretion. The best leaders surround themselves with very smart people and encourage them to be very candid. And you do need to require loyalty in the sense that I still want you to give me your best opinion. That opinion may not coincide with mine. So the best leaders, I just caught something, one of a few things I saw on TV, but about Lincoln, and during the time when he was trying to get the 13th Amendment. And his cabinet were all people that were bitter rivals. And not necessarily in accordance with him, but he encouraged them to debate, to bring forward what their thoughts were. And then you gather all that information, and then you hopefully make an informed decision. And so it really is important for that leader to encourage the people. You're talking about relational. The best leaders also bring out the best in those other people. And we can bring out leadership skills that these individuals may not have known they had. And so I can remember someone telling me that your job as a manager or as a leader is to match the task to the talent. And so you're basically searching, you're recruiting that talent. And once that employee shines, it gives them confidence, and they tend to be much more loyal to you, much more trustworthy. So we need to encourage those kinds of attributes in employees. And truthfulness and again, having sometimes controversial or disagreeing types of discussions may not happen in the open. There needs, if you have something to talk about, talk to me. If you need to talk to me in private, talk to me in private. But we need to encourage that.
I called that robust dialogue. It's not a personal thing, but it's like we're both trying to hopefully get to the same objective, the same goal, but there's something hindering that. Whatever that is, let's get it on the table. And sometimes that's difficult to have those conversations, but when you do, and you get a mature management team or whatever of people that buy into that, pretty soon you really can work some amazing things, together when it comes to some of the business goals anyhow that we've been able to see with some of that. So yeah, keen judgment is also where we're at here too, looking at those things. Sometimes there's decisions that are made that are judgment decisions that leaders have to make. But ultimately, they're also looking at a decision now that might affect the future as well. So we need to have the confidence in them to be able to do that, because not everything is black and white, always just straight down the point. Sometimes it's up to them to make those decisions. And then one of the other things he stops out here too is that great leaders remain humble. Godly leaders will stay humble. We can look at a lot of those things, but we also know that we don't have the control of when we're going to die. We don't have the control of the wind or who's going to add the wind to those things. He's looking at those things. It says, a statement was said, truly wise leaders take direction from the Lord above, but advice from those below. And I think that's what you were getting at too there. So just a quick little jump here too. I said something about leaders and managers. There is a difference between leadership and management. We're not going to spend a lot of time here. Just a couple things to look at. Sometimes you'll see leaders that will look for change in a sense, and change could, the word on change is not change anymore because that's a scary word, but it's continuous improvement. You want to keep finding solutions, continuous improvement, versus maybe managers just want to keep the status quo in those things. Conflict, sometimes leaders use those for, like Arlene was saying a little bit, in some cases of robust dialogue, or also just use them as teaching moments versus trying to avoid any kind of conflict in general. And again, that's not personal conflict. We don't want to ever cause any of those problems, but when we're looking at those things, sometimes leaders give the credit, sometimes managers take the credits. But ultimately, leadership is really kind of a style of transformational. Somebody that will just be transformational versus management sometimes is just about the transaction. some of those things. So there is differences in those things. But let's look at a couple quick questions again. Thinking the example of Jesus, what makes a leader approachable versus unapproachable? So what do you have for question 3 there? What can you think of?
I think the number one thing is you have to show people that you really care about them, not simply what they can do to help you solve a problem, but you care about them as individuals. So what is happening in their family that's affecting their workday affects you, and you care about that. Not because you're not getting something out of them, but because they're people, and they have independent lives. And what I found in my career is it's better to be open for people to come talk to you, even if it's things you don't want to hear. Like someone sharing, I'm contemplating leaving, I'm contemplating doing something else. If they know they can talk to you, I can't tell you how many times people have made the decision to stay, not because I've convinced them to stay, but because I was very open with them and said, let's just talk about it. Tell me what are your pros and cons? And, well, you know what? If that's the best for you, go ahead and do that. And when you encourage them for what's best, that's the kind of people they want to be around.
So how do you extrapolate that to Jesus now, too?
What's that now?
How do you extrapolate that to Jesus?
Jesus always cared about us before himself. We weren't his stepping stones. He was our stepping stone.
Right.
And we have to remember that our position, if we are blessed to be in some semblance of leadership that people recognize, our goal is to help other people get to where they need to be, not to use them to elevate ourselves.
Yep, good point. Amy, go ahead.
The greatest leaders of all time have been men that have learned to submit first. Like Moses and Joshua was his servant for a long time before God made him a leader. And what Joseph went through before God placed him in a leadership position, they had to learn that submission to God first. And in learning to do that and being like Jesus, putting others first, like he's saying. And Moses was the meekest man alive, and he was the greatest leader, so.
Any other examples you can think of that, go ahead back here, Tim, or somebody else say something up here?
Along that line, I always think about David. If you're taking care of sheep for several years, then you learn compassion, sweetness, calmness. And so that's, of course, Jesus emulates all of those.
Yep.
When you look at why people follow the instances where people followed Jesus, I think of the sinful woman who ran into him. Why would she go to him, given presumably what her background was? Everyone knew she was this, quote, sinful woman. But he was so attractive to her that she was willing to do not only personally uncomfortable things, but socially uncomfortable things to get to him. And you just see that all over, And so it's what Bill said, it's what Tim said. It relates to the verse maybe here, if I understand at least part of it right, in chapter 8, verse 6. For every matter there is a time and a judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. That's the New King James Version. Being around leaders doesn't mean things are going to be easy. New ESV, I think, says there in verse 6, there's a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. That's when we need leadership from other people. So one reason Jesus was such an effective, made him approachable, is when things were really hard, he didn't turn around and dump shame on people. Or, well, you got yourself into this. So, that's not how his approach. People did get themselves into those things. I get myself into a lot of things, but it's not his approach to that. I mean, that's part of his message, but not in a judgmental, shaming kind of a way.
Yeah.
And so that means people are willing to follow you.
Right.
And we see that with him as well.
Yeah, the approachability. Also see how he washed his own apostles' feet, looking at showing them an example that the master is not any more important than the servant, working at those things too. So, Shauna?
I think of all the apostles leaving their jobs and not getting paid, going with him, letting them teach them because they knew they were getting enriched in such a different way. And there are so many times where we have been in jobs where we have bosses that we love because they are so kind to us or they're excellent teachers, and we maybe even pass up a job opportunity because we want to stay with them. And that just kind of reminds me of a great leader.
Yeah.
You know, because you don't want to give up something, even though it could be better for you in the long run financially, because you're at the feet of a great teacher.
Yeah. Good point. So,
I think it's interesting going back a couple slides as you kind of laid out, you know, leaders seeing the big picture. I think looking at all of these, one of the things that immediately jumps out to me is the worst leadership and how you could still be wildly successful even being a horrible leader. So having the big picture, the greatest example that I can come up with, Apple. Apple was run by Steve Jobs. If you actually start looking into his life, and everybody who knew him, everybody who worked with him, hated him. He hated everybody. He treated them like dirt. He was always, if you wanted to come talk to him, he would cuss you out. You're beneath him. He's not going to talk to you. He obviously created a brand, which is how we essentially know in 2023 that you can create something as a vision and still be successful even if everything else about it is terrible. Like, we now know that the children building the Apple phones have nets outside their windows so that they can't commit suicide anymore. That we now know that's his legacy. He built phones, and it was all built on it's going to be so expensive, nobody's going to be able to afford it. Well, it doesn't matter because it's Apple, and he just kept pushing it and kept pushing it, and now everybody turns, and he's a genius. He's this he's a thought leader, and he's so wise and so smart, when in reality he died by himself, miserable, and he left a legacy of just people hating everything about how he lived his life, but still, because we liked what he produced, then he's still somehow a great leader.
yeah, there's leadership lessons can be learned both by good leaders and by bad leaders. You just learn different lessons, right? So let's just jump ahead just real quick here. As Amy mentioned a minute ago, and there's so many different biblical leaders, leadership models we can see. We talked about Jesus a little bit. Job kind of reminds me a little bit of the way Solomon's been talking about, hey, our mortality is something. Job had that model mindset: naked I came in, naked I'm going to go back. Just really that mindset there. Moses, as you mentioned on there, all the way through. Daniel demonstrated his faith in public, something that we can all take a little bit more lesson and maybe application on ourselves. Paul, you talk about transformational leadership. To see what Paul did after he met Jesus in Acts chapter 8, he's ravaging the church, killing saints. In Romans chapter 8, he's turned around wanting to, or excuse me, that's chapter 9. Chapter 9, and then he's basically saying, I'll give up my soul for my fellow man. Just an amazing transformation. So there's several of those. You could go on and on. Lessons you can learn from bad leaderships too. Pharaoh, wasn't willing to change his mind. He kept lapsing back. That's something that leaders need to be able to change their mind from time to time. What about Samson? Again, talking about discreet tongue and watching out for what you say. That's something that leaders need to be looking at, and we can look at that too. Saul, as mentioned earlier, about how his really envied the success of others in David's count when they were singing the Saul killed his 1,000, David his 10,000s. Pilate, rationale, basically I'll do nothing, I'll wash my hands of the matter, therefore making a decision, but kind of weeding out on it. There's just so many, it could just go on and on and on. The biblical narrative, the Bible, the Word of God that we have has so much in it about leadership. And as we said earlier, it's a myth if you think you're not a leader. You are a leader in some way or another. So there's so many different lessons we can learn over time of looking at these different examples have been laid out for us. We're pretty much out of time tonight. We'll look at just a couple more things on that, and then we're going into the losers and unsolved mysteries part of this lesson on Wednesday night. So thank you very much for your good attention and your comments.